Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is 6th of August, and in today's upload we're looking at a plethora of frontline updates. I will begin with Kupiansk because I think that's the most pressing issue to look at today, but we're also going to zoom in on the Torske battle along with the Serebriansk forest. We'll zoom in a bit on what's going on near the Kupyansk reservoir because there are some rumors that I want to address. We'll zoom in, of course, on the Vavcha riverfront, basically on the border between southern Donetsk and Dnipro. So today is going to be rather interesting. We'll look at the topographic map for the key parts of the front line, such as Kupyansk and Klebanbek. And probably tomorrow, I'll look at the political situation following the meeting between Putin and Witkoff. So let's zoom in over here and look at the latest updates from Kupyansk, because you can see the Russian forces have been able to achieve a really important advance that is going to change the course of the battle over here. You can see that they've been able to circumvent the city, so they're not necessarily pushing all of their forces and accumulating them with the intention of storming the city directly, because we have the eastern and western banks of the Oskil River. So the western bank over here is larger in terms of surface area, population, amount of structures and such. So again, the Russian forces, in previous videos, we talked about how they were able to push all the way up until the city limits. Now they've been able to find a weak point in the Ukrainian line, and that's around the village of Moskovka. So you can see that the village is now marked as red because it's largely under Russian control. They've been able to take over within the past 48 hours nearly 4.4 square kilometers of territory. So that includes staving off a bit of the northern outskirts of Kupyansk. And you can see that over here with the capture of a couple of garages in the gas station, warehouses, and then a bit to the northeast, you have over here the capture of some forested areas and local roads. So once again, the Russians improving their tactical position. But the more interesting advance occurred over here because the entirety of the village of Moskovka was taken over. The Russians crossed over the Kupianka River, which is very narrow over here. It's really a non-issue. And then they were able to penetrate at a distance amounting to 3.4 4 kilometers, rather southwards, and they're able to arrive at the area just east of Sobolivka. This is something that should not be happening under the current circumstances, because when you look at the entire vertical length over here of the city of Kupiansk, it really does amount to about 4.7 kilometers. So it shouldn't even be possible for the Russian forces in one maneuver and one fell swoop to penetrate that deep behind the Ukrainian line and get so close to some of the key supply lines that are feeding Kupiansk and, by extension, the entire 250 square kilometer bridgehead across the Oskil River, which still contains a lot of important defensive fortifications, a lot of key villages that haven't even been touched yet, but they could be threatened existentially due to this move coming in from the west. And as a result, the Russian forces will be saving a lot of time and resources that otherwise would have gone into investments trying to grind down the Ukrainians along the front line, along areas that had already been defended for 2 or 3 years. So we're going to get into all of that right now. I just want to show you guys some of the footage from recent days indicating these Russian advances. We have over here a video from August 6th. There were 2 Russian soldiers in separate clips that were filmed, and they were just walking out in the open, near open areas, including very close to Sobolivka itself. They weren't necessarily like in the center of the village, but you can see based on the overhead footage that it's completely empty. It's not necessarily damaged. It was obviously damaged to a certain degree 3 years ago when the Ukrainians took it back and there was some fighting over here, but it was at the time very transient. And the same thing is happening over here with the Russian side taking it back without much fanfare. So you already have DRGs operating in this area that have cut off the road. There's a local route between Nechivodivka and Kupyansk. And this served as a pretty important road because obviously you have this direct highway coming in from the southwest all the way into Kupyansk. So that's still intact and that's still within Ukrainian control, albeit now it's far closer to the Russian lines maybe before. But you also had a couple of other lines. For instance, this one over here, a local route coming from the north, passing through Moskovka, and then from there you get into Kupiansk, and then this one over here. So you can already see how the Russians cut off 2 routes that were supplying the city. And you could see now, based on the measuring stick, that the Russian forces are only about 1.6 kilometers away, meaning that it's going to be within the range of some direct Russian fire. They're going to bring in forces to enter into the forested region as well. That's where DRGs are really able to pull off their tasks without getting spotted by Ukrainian drone crews. And at that point, they'll be able to traverse the entirety of the forest and arrive at the highway and just cut it off completely, both in terms of firing at it directly, which can be done through small arms, or if it's a bit farther away, through snipers. And over here, you can see how DRGs can just physically cut it off. It doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily have solid control immediately, but they're just going to make it impossible for the Ukrainians to pass through. So that's extremely concerning. And that's why it's incumbent upon the Ukrainians, if they have the wherewithal to do so, to organize first of all, stabilization of the line. But stabilizing the front line as it is right now is simply not going to be feasible either. There has to actually be action to reverse these current Russian gains, because otherwise, the Russian forces are simply going to continue capitalizing on this. They have the momentum over here, and they already have a window of opportunity to completely take over the city through this maneuver. And I'll explain how, because you can see that, let's say we take the highway out of the equation, then you have this span of territory amounting to about 3.75 kilometers, if I'm being generous. And a lot of that just goes through the P79 highway. And that highway is running essentially adjacent to the Oskil River. So it's not coming in from the rear to the west in Kharkiv. It's coming directly north from, or directly south rather, from areas that are still pretty close to the front line. And so you can understand how cumbersome and inefficient it would be to move supplies, move forces, and get people out from Kupyansk, let alone move them across the river, which is a whole different story. So you'd have this one highway, and then you have, I suppose, the local entrances, and they're not even through paved roads or even gravel roads. You don't even have those. It's just completely open fields until you arrive at the southernmost districts of Kupiansk. So those would still be open in this corridor over here. And honestly, anything to the east of the P79 wouldn't really be an option, because at that point, you're already basically next to the river. No supplies are really coming through that direction. They're all coming in from a westward axis. So looking at the connectivity between western and eastern Kupiansk, the eastern side, it does not have as many residential districts. It does not contain that amount of houses, large amount of residential buildings or apartments compared to the western side. But there are a lot of key industrial zones. There's an armory over here that included a lot of ammunition that was stored underground. You have a couple of reservoirs and ponds and warehouses and factories and such. So all of those are important structures for defense, and a lot of them can be used in the case of urban warfare. But now that the Russian forces are sort of circling around and are pretty close to cutting off some of the key supply lines, it's going to make it difficult for Russian, or rather Ukrainian soldiers, to be sent in as reinforcements or to move in some sort of resupply to the massive garrison that is located to the east of the Oskil River, which, of course, springs out of and is based out of the eastern parts of Kupyansk, but it encompasses much more than that. To the north, it encompasses this area that amounts to 17 square kilometers of territory. Open areas, includes forested regions as well, that are part of why the Ukrainians have been able to hold out is due to their resistance using DRGs, trying to hold out in these forested regions, which has made it so hard for the Russians to solidify control. So this area would obviously be under threat, because you'd have to draft a measure through which actual reinforcements could arrive into that area. And Ukrainians also have to ensure that there's still an escape route, because once that becomes a difficult issue, and once they are unable to feasibly do that, then it becomes far more chaotic, and then the threat of being completely encircled takes over. And then, of course, usually the Ukrainians are able to pull out in the final moments with a lot of these cauldrons that we've seen over time, Avdiivka and such. But it's always done with higher casualties as a result of waiting until the last moment. And that's a part of the trade-off that the Ukrainians sort of tacitly understand when they do remain over here past the sort of a normal time. So you look at it, and you have Eastern Kupiansk, you have Kucherivka, Petropavlivka, all these areas that were really well defended in terms of frontal assaults. And you could see the way in which the Ukrainians set up their defenses over here. They built around the northeastern entrances. They built around ditches and ravines to ensure that the Russians couldn't attack from like Vilshana. And the Russians, when they did, it was always in a really slow process that wasn't able to yield much. And so the Ukrainians, in that regard, were able to achieve their defensive success over here. But in isolation, that's obviously a positive. But once you look at the bigger picture and the fact that now they're being flanked from the other side of the river, now you can realize how a lot of the defenses are going to be rendered superfluous before the Russians even arrived at them. Same thing would go for all of these like key ridges that the Ukrainians still retain control over, like this one over here, here as well, this area, all these ridges where you had some trenches built as a sort of fallback defense line to defend the outer ring before you arrive at the outskirts of Kupyansk and the other villages over here. And Stepovano-Vasilivka was supposed to act as a final buffer zone, and the Russians are actually closing in on it now, but it's not their main focus. But the fall of that would sort of lead to a Ukrainian withdrawal to this crescent shape defense, which would be very compact and would include a pretty experienced garrison that has been fighting over here for a while. And so now, with the threat coming from the west, a lot of the sort of bloodshed that could have occurred and a lot of the time that could have been dragged out may actually not come into fruition in reality, because there could be some quick movements over here if the situation is not contained, obviously, as I was reiterating at the time. But this is a part of why, from the beginning, we took a keen eye and really did a look at what was going on to the west of the Delska River, and the fact that the Russian forces were able to establish a forward operating base in Dvorichnya. And Ukrainian forces, they did not take the threat seriously for about 3 weeks. And in that time, we were consistently saying that there definitely need to be reinforcements moved in. And eventually they were, and you could look at them on the map. Now there is actually a pretty good composition of Ukrainian forces, but it's too little too late, because the Russian forces already established control over key areas and were able to establish pretty good supply lines, not necessarily through pontoons or ferries. I don't even know if those were established at this point, but they did use drones and were able to transport the necessary food, water, ammunition crates via those drones. And they've been saying that it's been completely successful and the process is very streamlined. So they don't need armored vehicles necessarily for these operations. So it's not that critical to establish a pontoon that would actually allow for tanks to move through. The tank elements that are operating over here, because there are some, are on the eastern bank of the river, like the 153rd Tank Regiment, and they are just in theory supposed to sell towards Petropavlivka, although I don't know if that's even going to happen now. You look at the Russian garrison, we'll start with it, then we'll move to the Ukrainian one. Russian garrison over here consists of the 68th Motor Rifle Division, and previously this was named the 25th Motor Rifle Brigade. If you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you know we always talked about them, and we actually included some footage of them from a couple of years ago. So they've been always floating around here, engaged in the clashes in the forested area near the river. And due to their bloated size, they were reformed into a division, and a lot of new units were put under their umbrella. A lot of these territorial motor rifle regiments, like the 121st and the 122nd, and I know they're over here somewhere on the map, but I don't know their like specific unit icons. So I just gave all the motor rifle regiments the same one. But you do know, if you click on the map, you'll see that the majority of the units that are deployed over here are within this category of being established in late 2023 or sometime in 2024, and don't have the same level of experience or wherewithal as previously established units like the old guard of the 68th Division or the 27th Brigade, which is another one of the key units operating around here. So the 27th Motor Rifle Brigade, they are leading the spearhead. So they've been conducting some of the cutting edge attacks and are engaging in some of the breakthroughs, and they're being supported with the manpower. And there certainly is a lot of manpower, because you add it up, and I haven't done it yet, but I will. You add up the amounts of soldiers within each regiment individually, and it comes out to a pretty sizable garrison. Now the quality isn't necessarily the top tier, and that's why there's a lot of emphasis placed on the experienced units like this one and the old guard from the 68th Motor Rifle Division, which is for the most part stationed to the east, but also does have some regiments that are deployed to the west. So that's a bit on the order of battle for the Russian side. Whereas on the Ukrainian side, you could see over here that the northern parts of the bridgehead is controlled by the 3rd Tank Brigade, and they've recently been supplemented by a lot of these Russian origin units. So, the Sibir Battalion is over here. They were moved in from the Sumy region. Same thing with the Russian Volunteer Corps. We have as well elements of the main intelligence directorate. I know the Timor units used to be operating around here, but now they're sort of split off and they're everywhere. But you do have the Special Separate Battalion Arata from the main intelligence directorate. So they're also in this region. You have the 8th Battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade and a couple of other separate battalions that are just operating independently over here. You have some drone crews. You have, what unit is this? I believe that this element is the Northern Eagle System Battalion. So this is a part of 151st Mechanized Brigade. And that gets us to the next category of forces over here. A lot of the 150 series brigades that were established as a part of this pilot program to create these NATO-style units, 15 of them were drafted and eventually implemented. So that includes this one, and a lot of them were moved to this part of the front line to engage in defensive maneuvers. So that includes 151st, 154th, which I know is over here, and also 158th. They were recently moved away from Sumy and are deployed to this region. So we have seen a downscaling of the Sumy front for the Ukrainian side. It's not significant by any means. There's still a very large garrison of Ukrainian forces over there, but some were moved to nearby locations like the Kharkiv area, which, in relative terms, compared to all the other parts of the front line, is about the closest you can get, obviously, besides Vovchansk. That's not a critical part of the front line right now. So, yeah, that's why they were deployed to this region. You have a couple of units that are actually more involved in the current heated areas that are directly north of Kupyansk. So that would include the Comanche drone unit, which is a part of the 40th Artillery Brigade, which is involved in all of the artillery fixing and fire towards the Russian side. You have 115th Battalion of the 110th TDF Brigade, 12th Tank Battalion, also redeployed from Sumy recently. And then this is the main one, the 15th Karadag National Guard Brigade. They're famous because they fought in Selidove and held off for a couple of months before being overran. So they had a period of rotation and then were deployed about 4 months ago to this part of the front line. So they're currently one of the key units involved in trying to counterattack, trying to hold out in individual villages. And so far they've been pushed out. And they may be the same unit that was pushed out of Moskrovka as well, although there were a couple of other candidates for that. They're receiving some level of support from the Wild Hornets drone units, also, I believe, previously operating in Sumy. And then you have the 114th Territorial Defense Brigade. So they are the ones that are directly holding in Western Kupiansk, which is certainly concerning because even though they've been operating over here in this part of the front line since like late 2024, their caliber is certainly lower given the classification as a territorial defense brigade, and they are most likely exhausted due to not being afforded a sort of rotation or rest period. And we do know that over the past 4 or 5 months, the situation has been very intense around here due to the Russian forces crossing over the river and consistently expanding. So, this is the sort of unit that you'd expect to be rotated. And so, even though there are a lot of units that are holding out across the entire width of the bridgehead, which is certainly important because you don't want the Russians achieving some sort of deep penetration towards the line of trenches that was built over here or any other medium-sized town like Obukhivka. And then, like in the long term, Veliki Burluk's a major one. It's also like a hub for a lot of roads that pass through here. So that's why the Ukrainians have to deploy forces to hold out over there. But as a result, they're pinned down against smaller Russian forces because, for the most part, the Russian forces are now focused on the Kupyansk region. So not necessarily on the ridges or the narrow parts of the Oskil River to the north. And therefore, the Ukrainians have less manpower to play with and to deploy to the area circling around Kupyansk. So that's the trade-off that happens as a result, and that means that there are gaps in the Ukrainian line, even though on paper it appears as though they have a lot of reinforcements. And this is why we saw this breakthrough occur, because under normal circumstances there would be some sort of rear unit that could be sent in to quickly mobilize and cause a situation to not deteriorate to the degree that it has. So again, just to reiterate, the fear that you would see from the Ukrainian side is that they're hoping now that the Russians won't be able to cut off this road and then take advantage of all the forced patches, push through DRGs, and solidify control, send in reinforcements to cut off this other highway, and then eventually reach the river itself. Because let's say the bridges across Kupiansk aren't able to really serve as a network or branch out into the rest of Kharkiv, because you do have the city of Kharkiv, obviously, you have Chuhuiv, you have a bunch of other key cities that were taken over during the course of the Kharkiv counteroffensive in 2022. So you have over here several bridges that across the river, and the river over here is not necessarily that wide, but you do have this sort of floodplain in between. You have this one, you have this bridge span over here, and there's another one, and they cross over the Oskil within the city itself. So you have two bridges over there, and then you have here near Kupyansk, Vuzlovi, there's another bridge, although it's claimed to be destroyed. These are from probably 2023, these claims. So I'm not sure if they were restored at that point or whether they were completely destroyed at the time or whether some sort of pontoon was put in place nearby, because there probably are some pontoons the Ukrainians set up because they were not under intense bombardment up until recently over here. So I could certainly see that being the case. So it's not like the Ukrainians in these other regions would necessarily be cut off, but we're talking about volume, and we're talking about the fact that there are a lot of Ukrainian units deployed to this region. You do have the 30th Mechanized Brigade, key unit involved in defense north of Kupyansk. We have the 14th Mechanized Brigade as well, defending in Petropavlivka. They have been doing so for like 2 years now, as well as a litany of other smaller units that are defending. 2nd National Guard Special Purpose Battalion, 43rd Mechanized Brigade, 116th split between Sumy and this part of Kharkiv right now. You have 104th TDF Brigade, and then near Hlushkivka, the Ukrainians also deployed forces that are ensuring that the situation doesn't deteriorate over there. So you're looking at a 250 square kilometer chunk of territory. This is not the entire bridgehead. Is actually way more than that. So don't get mistaken by the description. You look at the actual polygon for this bridgehead, and it amounts to 250 square kilometers. So it's a large chunk of territory to be losing or to have cut off from the wider rear over here to the west. So that's why it's a concerning development. And the Russian forces will be able to bypass a lot of the fiercest parts of urban battles that the Ukrainians have been really able to use to their advantage, being able to drag the Russians into an urban clash and resist with smaller numbers and hold out until the last moment, because then to a certain degree they're treating the Russian side, but also themselves in the process. But at the very least, they're able to reduce the tempo of the advances and concentrate everything on an urban area. But now you could see how the Russian forces simply circumvented that. So certainly something we have to keep an eye out for, because the situation could change depending on the Russian forces trying to exploit this even further. So definitely I would keep an eye out for it, and we'll continue updating that situation. But it's not the only thing that we have to look at today, because also around Shandra-Kov, the Russian forces have made some headway. They captured this area north of Sredny. This amounts to 0.75 square kilometers of territory. You could see over here that the Mara unit from the 66th Mechanized Brigade conducted FPV strikes on those individual Russian soldiers as they make their way near tree lines, near forested patches, near ravines into the village. So they're getting very close to taking it over in a small surface area. So you could imagine that it would suffer a similar fate to Ritkodub and other similar sized villages in this area. Also, you have this advance by the Russian side to the northeast of Shandra-Kov. So the Russian forces are advancing along this paved road from Zelena Dolina. This is from August 4th. I may have talked about it. I'm sorry if I did, but they did conduct FPV strikes at the 2nd Battalion of the 66th Mechanized Brigade on an MCLB and on infantry over here as they were getting closer to arriving at the town. So now you can see how the walls are closing in from two directions, and you could see how this sort of two-pronged attack could play out. And this area is defended by the 115th Mechanized Brigade. But after that point, that would open up the floodgates for deep Russian advances along this northwestern flank of Liman. But that's not the only thing that's happening right now. We have two other vectors of attack that the Russians have been able to find success in. So first of all, you have over here the capture of 0.7 square kilometers of territory as the Russian forces push from the southern axis all the way into the center of Torske. So this video is from August 5th. 4 Russian soldiers were filmed in central Torske, and I want to actually show you guys the advance over here. It amounts to 1.4 kilometers northwards, and this means that the surface area within sort of the Zerebets bridgehead east of the river is continuing to constrict. You can see over here about 7.25 square kilometers of territory remaining, most of that being open areas where you have very small quantities of Ukrainian soldiers actually defending. For the most part, they're holding out near the church area. Over here, you have the local church and a couple of other residential buildings wherein the fighting continues. But the Russians are making an effort to close in from the south. That's where most of their effort is focused on. And at the same time, they're also continuing to deepen their attacks and advances on the rear in the Serebriansk forest. So according to Deep State, this is what they claim. They're saying that the Ukrainians, they had a TDF brigade, a territorial defense unit, that was deployed to this area that was really not prepared for a deep rear penetration by the Russian side. So they were caught off guard, including their drone units. They were not able to respond in time. And therefore, the Russian side was able to reach some of the Ukrainian strong points several kilometers behind the rear and take them over, and thereby create a lot of cauldrons and a lot of opportunities for pockets to form. So we can start off with this advance near the river directly. So the Russian forces just siphoned off some of this region over here, 1 square kilometer. There aren't that many strong points over here, and it is sort of the most disconnected from the rear. So the Ukrainians don't have a lot of density and forces over in there. But an area where the Ukrainians are actually, known for being more present would be this northeastern corner, because there are a lot of trenches over here. that the Ukrainians continuously manned, and they also take advantage of the foliage to conceal themselves. But recent footage from this region does show that for the most part, there's no foliage anymore. The trees are still standing themselves, and you could see them, and that does cause some difficulty in spotting what's actually going on the ground. But there is basically no foliage left in this area, and that includes the regions near the trenches. So those trenches are also exposed and can be spotted via drone footage. So the Russian forces were able to tell where the Ukrainian line was weak and exploit that as a result. Now, in earlier videos, I talked about how one of these advances occurred from the east pushing westwards along this local road. And maybe that actually did happen, but according to Deep State's update, and we're going to see what ends up being correct in the end, because these movements are not stopping. But what they're alleging is that the advance towards the strong points, because you do have a couple of buildings over here, it seems like this is just like a shack region, and there may be some sort of associated houses as well. And it's maybe they're dachas actually, because it's next to a lake, so it's sort of like a resort area. But that's an area where Ukrainian forces were situated, and it's near some fortifications. So the Russian forces, we know they took it over, and that was around July 26th actually. So it's been a while. But the Deep State channel is alleging that it occurred from here, and they pushed 3 kilometers southwards. And the process also captured another 5 square kilometers, including a lot of dense forested areas that are no longer, consisting of a lot of leaves. You also have some of the trenches that the Ukrainians used as their fort positions just being overrun directly. And due to the penetration from the rear, you have this pocket that's formed. You have a really exposed Ukrainian salient, which is basically impossible to supply because it is so far away from the western bank of the Zherebets River. And the escape routes are very narrow because you do have, first of all, this corridor, which is going to receive a lot of pressure from the east and west, spanning about 2.5 kilometers. Then from there, you cross over forested areas near some of these or rivers, these sort of finger lakes, and they sort of remind me of the Finger Lakes in New York. And you can see over here that you have just a very small corridor of a couple of 100 meters, and that's about it. So trying to cross over there, it's certainly a narrow region that can be exploited by drone crews. And so certainly for the small amount of forces that are still remaining over here, it's going to be a difficult task to withdraw. But that's certainly going to be necessary as the Russian forces are trying to just get rid of these excess Ukrainian territories, get them under control, and then they themselves want to take advantage of the forested areas, especially the ones to the west that are less damaged, that haven't had trees leveled or foliage removed, so that can actually be used effectively by Russian DRGs to arrive at Liman. I think that's what they're trying to do over here. But first, they want to try to clear out the remnants and the vestiges of the Ukrainian defense that are still on the eastern bank of the river. You can see over here that there's a very high likelihood that the unit that was involved in the defense over here that was unable to stop the Russian advance was the 119th TDF Brigade. So we all remember them from the battle in Hirnik, and that was near the Vavcha River Valley. So they were unable to hold out over there, and that was a year ago. Now they've been redeployed to here, and similar story, they're being pushed back. So that's a bit on the Serebriansk area. Let's look at Toretsk and zoom in over here on the situation. So there are a couple of interesting updates. We'll start off with what's confirmed, and then we'll move on to some of the rumors. First and foremost, we have some geolocations backing up my yellow polygons. You have over here the capture of 3.25 square kilometers of territory based on this video, indicating that on August 5th, the 152nd drone group dropped grenades onto tree lines east of Nelipivka. And then over here, we have a video of the Predator Police Brigade on the same day conducting FPV strikes and grenade drops onto the same Russian infantry. In the southwestern diagonal direction, you could say that they advanced nearly 3 kilometers. And as a result, you have this new salient that has formed with Ukrainian holdouts trying to remain in this span of an anti-tank ditch and some of the nearby dugouts. So this area still remains under Ukrainian control, but you do have 2 prongs that are sort of stretching out on either end to the north and south. The Russian forces, as a result of these advances, have been able to get very close to some key fortified points that are running along tree lines. So you have this tree line over here that's really well defended and contains a lot of forces, a lot of ground assault battalions or defensive infantry battalions that are holding out over here. And they're trying to establish a certain solid line of defense based off of these multi-layered trenches. And you can see some of them over here on the map. This is a really pretty well sophisticated line but it's isolated and can be cut off and can be just attacked head on due to its small surface area. So the Russian forces, as a result, they are only, let's measure it, about 2.2 kilometers away from Plashivka and Lipivka. So these villages are under immense threat right now. And even further south, we do have another sort of similar concern because the Russian forces captured 0.84 square kilometers of territory. They advanced from the dachas in Dolivka, took over open fields and other dachas near this other pond area, and then arrived at some of the trenches set up by the Ukrainians near this local quarry, maybe that is, or maybe it's a Terracon, I'm not sure. And as a result, they're getting really close, dangerously close to the Klebambik Reservoir. They're only about 2.16 kilometers away when you measure the gray zone. So the area in between the Russian line of contact and their sort of like furthest spearhead and the reservoir itself contains a lot of defensive fortifications. So in another scenario wherein perhaps the Russian forces were trying to advance directly from the south and push up northwards, perhaps a lot of these sort of trenches and fortifications would have had a much better chance of holding out and dragging out the fighting. But because we have two prongs, because we have Ukrainian forces pinned down over here along the southern flank, and they're trying to hold out over here while their supply lines are under immense strain because, the corridor is so narrow at this point, and they're trying to supply Klebanbek and Kateryivka. And meanwhile, they're also receiving a lot of this direct pressure from the east due to several prongs that are sort of stretching out right now. You can imagine that the situation is becoming untenable. So, as I was saying, these are what we know for sure. But then you had some Russian sources claiming that the Russian forces were able to fully cut off the entire corridor, the 2.16 kilometer corridor, and therefore arrive at the Klamambik Reservoir. The reservoir, if you guys don't know, is this body of water over here. You can see that it spans from the Alexander Kalinova area in Yablonivka all the way to the east to Klamambik, the village itself. There's a dam over here to the west, and then there's this trench line that includes an anti-tank ditch to the south, which is currently still under Ukrainian control. My map is very generous to the Ukrainians because I still mark 50 square kilometers under their control on the map. You can see that over here. Whereas even Deep State, for instance, from Petrenko and a lot of other Ukrainian mappers, let alone the Russian ones, do say that, oh, this region has fallen into Russian hands. I just don't know that because there's been zero footage from this hinterland region between Romanivka and Leonidivka. You could see over here nearly 50 square kilometers. But it's certainly possible that due to the course of the fighting and due to how disconnected this area is from the rear in Konstantinivka, that they were forced to pull back a little and that the front line looks more like this. That's also been mentioned by some sources. So, we'll see what ends up being correct very soon. But certainly there still remains a significant presence of Ukrainian forces across the reservoir, and they're defending along this line. And they are trying to also remain in control of the populated areas from Kateryivka all the way to the northwestern chunks of Shcherbinivka. So all those areas, as a result of the narrow corridors, both the one from the west and the east, are threatened as a result because they would be completely severed and would have no way of escaping at that point. So that's what some Russian sources were alleging today, that the Russians had actually completed the full cutting off of the eastern and western lines. But other Russian sources rebuffed that and said that the Ukrainians were even spotted today moving forces back and forth, including on Humvees. So for the time being, it's not the case. But what we do know is that due to these recent advances, the Russian forces are now going to set up positions located at a higher elevation and consistently fire and gain fire control over all the routes leading into the reservoir. So I don't think the garrison is that large, even though on paper it could look that way because of the way in which I deploy the units over here. But you click on a random unit from this area, they're definitely headquartered in Konstantinivka and have most of their forces in that area on a day-to-day basis. Maybe some are deployed during the day across the villages over here and move southwards. But I wouldn't say that more than like 100, 150, 200 forces are actually here like on at any one time. That's probably what I would say. And once it becomes rather obvious that there's going to be no way out, they're going to definitely try to make a run for it and try to withdraw, but they're going to try to hold out for as long as possible, as long as it's feasible. And then they're going to leave in small groups. Obviously, they're not going to try to do it in any sort of like voluminous way because it would be immediately spotted. The Russians have amazing vantage points to overlook this area. And so what that entails essentially is that a massive buffer zone will fall into Russian hands, and then there will be a much stronger connectivity between the Delivka and Yablonivka garrisons. And then from there, they can sort of just close in on Konstantinivka from both directions, from the west and to the east, let's look at the topographic map actually to sort of get a concept of how this would actually look. So hopefully this map isn't completely wrong. Again, I'm doing it from memory, but you guys can see that the Ukrainians in this reservoir area south of it, they are just on extremely low elevation. There may be a bit of an upper area over here, but again, this is the area close to the gray zone. Certainly, the trenches are over here, really low elevation. Same goes for the villages. Whereas the Russian forces, they're advancing along the Delivka region, north of Toretsk, which is on moderately high elevation. Also, when you look at a sort of insular level over here, just to the east of Klabambik, you have this area, this little hill that overlooks the entire entrance point, because you have the road over here, and it moves southwards near the Kazani Torets River, and then from there branches out into, of course, the pocket, but it's located on some of the lowest elevation in this entire area. And same story with the western approach, which I don't even think is used at this point because it is so close to being cut off. So you look at the sort of future prospects for this area, and the Russian forces, they have not been particularly successful in the recent days. And I'm saying days because in recent weeks have been, but in recent days I'm saying the tempo has not been really fast over here in the area north of Yablonivka. This is an area that contains a lot of trenches, and it is located on a key height. And that's probably why. So the Ukrainian forces do have a lot of forces deployed to this area that are able to hold out. But it is one of the key targets that needs to be occupied by the Russian side as a precursor for an operation into Konstantinivka. So from there, they would be able to establish positions near the highway junction and, of course, on high elevation to completely overlook the valley on which Konstantinivka is located, right? And then from there, you have this higher elevated ridge sandwiched in between the rail line, which you see running near Alexandro. I don't even know what that says. And you could see over here to the west, you have this other Toretsk River line. So the region sandwiched in between is certainly falling into Russian hands now. This ridge over here, south of Bilohora, has already fallen into their hands. And to the north, you have the Russians taking over Sopochki and Prochetina and a bunch of other ridges that are near the Donbass Canal. So they're very gradually shaving off, taking over, chipping away at key ridges that will eventually converge in a sort of cauldron shape, yet again, in a sort of semicircle shape, and just completely overlook the approaches and ways in and out of Konstantinivka and, of course, the center of the city itself, which is on extremely low elevation. So just all the circumstances are really posed to be threatening and really going to be difficult for the defenders over here in the city to put up against once all these various directions begin to unify and coalesce around a singular target of taking over the city. So certainly keep an eye for that in the long term. And now let's move on a bit to the south because we don't necessarily have an update from the Pokrovsk region. I think tomorrow I'll discuss it, but I do want to finish off by looking at what's going on near the border with, yet again, Dnipro. First of all, I have altered the map, and this did not occur today, but it did happen over the past several days. Yalta is under Russian control. This is, again, acknowledged by all Ukrainian sources, but I had it marked for whatever reason under their tutelage, and that was because there was likely a counterattack about a week or a week and a half ago, so I altered the map and forgot to change it back once the Russian side took it over. So at the same time, we did receive reports today of about 5 square kilometers of territory being taken over in the area north of Khrushchevka and north, just to the east of Novokhatska. You can see it over here. You can see that this is the region I'm referring to, located generally in an open area. There are a couple of forested patches that were taken over by Russian infantry. And yet again, they're just trying to shape the battlefield in a way where they have control over the entirety of the southern bank of the river. There are a couple of key strong points that the Russian forces would like to take over near Dakhny, because, of course, the Ukrainians don't have many populated areas that they can convert into permanent defense nodes. So they've instead shifted their focus to holding on to forested patches. And there are a couple of them over here. So the next objective for the Russian side will be to overrun those locations. You can see them marked over here on the map, and some of them also extend a bit northwards to the region near Filia. You can see over here there's one of these networks as well. And then at the same time, they're supplemented by several layers of trenches that were built to the east of Filia. So you can see how there are some defenses trying to ensure the assault directly towards Novopavlivka is not feasible, not attainable. But again, for the time being, the Russian forces are not attempting yet to make a mad rush for it. They're instead focusing on just solidifying control over the southern bank of the river, especially in the areas near the border. So you can see that at the same time, they've gotten closer to just completely ridding the Voskresenka pocket of Ukrainian soldiers. They captured this 3.5 square kilometer chunk of territory, amounting to an advance northwards of about 5 or 1.5 kilometer, meaning that there is still some degree of Ukrainian activity over here because they do have this route from the border to Voskresenka and then from there to the open fields and tree lines, but it is continuing to diminish in scale. So right now, that's the current Russian objective, to take control over that village. And while the Ukrainians are so concerned with the course of the battle over there, they've actually been distracted and were not able to repel the Russians from crossing over the border yet again from Malivka, and they took over Sichineve. That was done by the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade, one of the key units involved in a lot of the village hopping campaign in this area. And now they've been able to take over another village in Dnipro Oblast. So this is really important because it means that some of the Ukrainian counterattack efforts can be reversed from the north with this northern pressure. And then from there, Malivka would be more secure. And you're looking at a very strong beachhead across the border, across the trenches, that can be used to shift focus southwards to the trench lines that are, reaching Zaporozhye, or on a more local level to take over Komishuvaka and all of the other. I think it's like over here, like 20 square kilometers, 30 square kilometers of territory that remains in southwestern Donetsk under Ukrainian control. And it could also, at the same time, be utilized as a linchpin to move up northwards and attack towards Alexandrod and the remaining parts of Voskresenka that have been fallen, and more generally undermine Ukraine's defense on the western bank of the Vovcha River. So certainly a lot of interesting opportunities as a result of these advances, and they do signal there is a weakness in the Ukrainian defensive line over here, because Sichineve is an area where you would expect there to be Ukrainian forces deployed. If they're fighting in Voskresenka and Malivka, then certainly the area in between should have some level of deployment and rapid reaction. But in this case, that was not the case. So we'll see if there is an attempt at a counterattack by the Ukrainians, like we saw with Malivka. Before I finish the video, I will look at the topography in Kupiansk. I don't know why I forgot about it, but I certainly do want to show you guys. So stay tuned. So this front line demarcation is probably wrong because I talked about Kupyansk 20 minutes ago. It's not fresh in my memory. But here you can see just a general sketch of the front line. The key takeaway are, first of all, the Vrishna located on low elevation, so it was very difficult for the Russians to just center their forces around there. It is a moderately sized village, but from there on out, they had to expand and actually attain control over some higher elevated areas. So that's what they did. They took over Zapadny, which is a bit to the south. You can't see it on the map, but it's over here. And then from there, they moved south, took over another layer of valleys. And again, at the same time, you're receiving support from the 68th Division and 2nd Division that are located on the eastern bank of the river, crossing over. So in conjunction, they were also able to secure the final layer of ridges that sort of feeds into the northeastern outskirts of Kupiansk over here, and this other sort of extended parts of a ridge. So that's just an understanding of how we even arrived at the situation. And from there, the Russian forces were able to cut off a valley. So this is a low-lying area stretching out of Kupiansk, and actually cross over the lower lying areas and arrive at the next ridge, this second and most important ridge that's defending Kupiansk from the western flank. So you have over here just a massive high ground area, and it stretches into this region sandwiched in between the H-26 highway and the city of Kupiansk itself. So it sort of ends at around the Oskil River. This narrow extension of the ridge is an area that used to be under full Ukrainian control and really wasn't even within the Russian purview. But now, due to this recent breakthrough, and you could see the push with the arrow over here, you can see how the Russians are already making headway to take it over in its entirety, take over this entire chunk of territory, and from there have complete dominance from an elevation standpoint to overlook the entirety of Kupiansk, all of the other villages along the Oskil River, and by extension, about a what's like 7 kilometer range or maybe 5 kilometer range directly east of Kupiansk in the 250 square kilometer bridgehead. So all these areas would be under threat as a result and overlooked and fired upon. And the Ukrainians can only do so much. Obviously, they have the advantage from a farther range to station their artillery units from the 40th Brigade over here and use that as an elevation sort of tool to fire against the Russian side. First of all, they're going to start taking over heights that will achieve parity. And it's not that important, the fact that the Ukrainians have artillery crews on high elevation, for the specific tactical situation that is currently developing within the outer ring of the city itself, which cannot be stopped by artillery itself. has to be stopped by forces on the ground. Even drone crews are now insufficient to stop some of these advances because of the momentum and because of the volume. So certainly a concerning situation elevation wise as the Russian forces continue making these advances. So you can see over here some of the juxtaposition between the elevation at its most extreme and at its least. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.